This is episode 106 of the Death to Tyrants podcast.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I'm your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Austin, Texas. And today we're going to discuss a topic that, quite honestly, I didn't have a lot of interest in. In fact, this is the first episode, and it's taken to episode 106 to discuss climate change, global warming, CO2 emissions, fossil fuels, and really I stayed away from that kind of stuff because there's so much bullshit, to be quite honest with you, in that world, and so much twisting up of statistics and catastrophizing everything that comes out, making it look like if we don't act in 12 years now, we're doomed. And Bernie Sanders said, we won't have a planet fit for our grandchildren. And when you think about that, look how old he is. His grandchildren are alive already. So there's so much crap to stay. It's kind of like right now with the shutdown coronavirus mess. You know, they're telling us, hey, if you walk outside and breathe towards someone, you're a grandma killer. And we get into basically that style of putting out information, the fear-mongering scare tactics, and what that really says about that person's particular angle on a cause or whatever they're trying to get at. And then, so like I said, to make a long story short, this was not stuff I found too much interest in because of the mounds of crap to get through to find truth. And I kind of stumbled upon this without even searching that hard. My guest today is Alex Epstein. And I stumbled across his book because I heard him. We get into this, so I won't bore you with it here. I heard him on some podcasts, and I thought, this guy's really good at everything he's talking about. And he wasn't even talking about climate change and fossil fuels when I heard him. So I looked him up, and he's got a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. I ordered it, and I also got an audiobook. It was devoured within a very, very short time. In fact, probably the shortest time I've devoured a book, maybe since Michael Malice's The New Right. I couldn't stop reading it. It was written very well, and there's lots of stuff in there that you're like, it's kind of red-pilling moments for this particular subject. And so I said, I've got to get Alex on the show, reached out to him, and he is on today. So I won't waste your time any longer. You might have seen Alex Epstein he's been on the Tom Woods show and Thaddeus Russell's show and all over the place, Dave Rubin, and he's here today. Alex Epstein is a philosopher who argues that human flourishing should be the guiding principle of industrial and environmental progress. He's the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, a New York Times bestseller, arguing that if we look at the whole picture, human flourishing requires that humanity use more fossil fuels, not less. The book has been widely praised as the most persuasive argument ever made for our continuing use of fossil fuels, winning Epstein the, quote, most original thinker of 2014 award from the McLaughlin Group. He founded Center for Industrial Progress in 2011 to offer a positive, pro-human alternative to the green movement. And that is all so refreshing and rare to see. What an excellent way of looking at this, all of this stuff. And he's here with us today. Alex Epstein, welcome to the show. Thanks for some of your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I got to start off by complimenting you on this book. You know, the topic, at least for me, the topic of climate change and fossil fuels, solar, wind, etc., never piqued my interest a whole lot over the years because there's so much craziness involved with it. And I know you realize that. But man, I came up on this book, and I feel like a latecomer. It came out in 2014, but I could not stop reading it.
So how did you learn about the book?
I saw you on, let me think. It was a collection of, I had heard you several times on other podcasts, Tom Woods. I believe I saw you recently on Thaddeus Russell's show. And I thought, this guy's really good at speaking every time I see him. Let me check out his book. And so
The interviews served their purpose.
They did. And I believe the one I heard you with on Tom most recently, you were talking about the lockdown more so than the book, but it was so good. I just said, what's this guy write about? Let me check it out. So I got it. And one of the few books I've ever read that I didn't put down really for until I was done with it. So it was awesome. And thanks for being here. Before we get into the book, tell my listeners what you do, because I'm sure there's some hater out there thinking, well, he's in the pocket of big oil or something. What do you do?
Well, interestingly, maybe at the end of the interview, they wouldn't think it's a bad thing to be in the pocket of big oil. I just don't happen to have that business model myself. So, I mean, I consider myself I think of myself as a practical philosopher. So my favorite subject is philosophy, which is really about how do you think logically about important issues in life. And about 13 years ago, I started learning about energy, which I had no pre-existing interest in. And I realized, wow, this is the industry that powers every other industry. The decisions we make about energy are so consequential to everything else. And I started suspecting the way we were thinking about energy was distorted in a lot of ways. I think one straightforward thing is we just tend to look at all the positives of solar and wind and all the negatives of fossil fuels and nuclear. And I didn't really know any facts about it at the time, but I just knew with that kind of skewing or bias, there's no way you're going to make rational kinds of decisions. So 13 years ago, I started it, and pretty quickly it became my full-time obsession. And then I was working at a think tank at the time, the Ayn Rand Institute. And then in 2011, I started my own organization called the Center for Industrial Progress. And I can get into detail about that, but for our purposes now, the focus of that has been energy. And so what I do is I write books and I give speeches. And then I also help energy companies communicate the basis for pro-freedom policies to different audiences. So I work in the kind of PR space, but not in the conventional way of a company comes to me and they say, hey, like, help us with whatever we want. But if they're actually advancing freedom, then I might work with them to help them advocate freedom using some of my different approaches.
That's interesting. Do you get major companies that have that angle, that they are trying to push for more freedom or liberty?
Yeah, definitely. I've worked with major companies. Now, there's different levels of that. So, what you wish, I won't even name specific companies, but you would wish is like the biggest companies would say, we want total energy freedom and we're going to totally redirect our company around that. I have not achieved that coup yet, but often on specific policies, a company will want it, and sometimes on more general things. And in particular, I'm sure we'll talk about CO2. If you're talking, there are definitely significant companies who are in some way substantially willing to stand up to the catastrophism around CO2, and really the calls for the nationalization of the energy industry in the name of reducing CO2 levels. And so when those opportunities come up, I'm excited to have them come up, because I think it's very important for businesses, for the people producing a product, to be advocates of the product and to be advocates of the freedom to produce it. And in most industries, it's not an issue whether they're an advocate of the product. But in the fossil fuel industry, that is a real issue, because we're all taught that it's bad, that at best it's a necessary evil that we need to get off very quickly. And many of the companies and even the CEOs have internalized this idea of we're at best a necessary evil. So whenever I can find people who are more on the side of, no, this is not a necessary evil, this is a superior good, and this is crucial to the future, then it's cool to be able to work with them.
I think one of the things, at least for me, in this overall discussion of climate change and CO2, the way you phrase it and the mission statement really of your book was a nice difference and a refreshing change. Before we get into the details of the book, can you give the listeners the approach that you took here in explaining the moral case for fossil fuels?
Well, I'm curious how, I'll give my own version, but I'm curious how you retained it. Like how would you think of it?
Well, I would say that basically the moral case you're taking is, when you look at it, the morality aspect of it is what's good for human life, what's good for human flourishing, and raising humans up from a level of poverty to not necessarily rich, but maybe from, we could say, third world to first world if possible. And that's the take that I got from it.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked. Yeah, so just another perspective on that. I think you're very right at the core. Is that whenever you're talking about an issue and what to do about an issue, there's always a question of what is your standard by which you're judging things as good and bad. So if you take like the issue of fossil fuels impact on the world, is it good or bad, or is it mixed or whatever? There's a question of by what standard are you evaluating the world? And I evaluate the world, including what you can think of as our environment, the natural environment and the changes we make to it or not. I think of those from a human perspective. So I evaluate changes to the world as, are they good for human beings or are they not? So for example, if people have a forest and they don't have homes and the forest is necessary for them to have homes, like I consider that an improvement of the earth for them to cut down the trees and to make a home. Like I endorse that early stage of progress, and including, I think it's great that we make houses, and I think it's great that we make skyscrapers. Sometimes we do them badly and we can make mistakes in doing them. But overall, I think when we are reshaping the earth to benefit human beings, that's a good thing. But what I've noticed is that usually when people are thinking about the world, particularly in the last several decades, their standard is not human flourishing. Their standard is minimal impact. So the idea is the less impact we make on the earth, the better. And I think of that as an anti-human idea. Of course, we want to minimize our negative impacts, our anti-human impacts. So you want to avoid unnecessary pollution and that kind of thing. But you don't want to minimize development. You don't want to minimize transforming the earth, because transforming the earth is how we survive. And I think a lot of what happens in the fossil fuel issue is people are very unclear whether they're evaluating the impacts of fossil fuels by the standard of human flourishing or the standard of minimal impact. So for example, with climate, is it really that people are so concerned with climate because they think we're impacting the climate in a way that's so bad that it offsets all the benefits we get from fossil fuels, including, by the way, the ways we use fossil fuels to protect ourselves from climate? Like, do they really think that? Or do they just have the idea it's wrong to change the climate? And so if some scientist tells them, well, we're changing the climate some, they think, oh, it's a catastrophe and we have to stop. And it's in this sense of the issue of your standard, or what I sometimes call your standard of evaluation, that totally determines how you process the facts. And what I find is this debate is a very philosophical debate. It really comes down to what's your standard of evaluation? What's your standard of good and bad? And I think if you're really consistently on a pro-human standard and you look at the facts from that perspective, you end up having a much more positive evaluation of fossil fuels than you could ever imagine.
It seems like more so than any topic out there in the realm of politics, except now maybe the lockdown and the coronavirus, but the fear mongering and the fear tactics of those in what we'll call the green movement. It's almost like there's a religious like fundamentalism aspect to it, very much so. Do you see that? And why is there such a fear-based issue with this stuff?
Well, I think there's a lot of parallels to the lockdown. They're not all the parallels. Like I consider the coronavirus much more dangerous than I consider rising CO2 levels. I mean, on balance, I don't consider those dangerous insofar as we have such a good adaptive capability that there's nothing I'm really worried about in terms of what rising CO2 levels will do. Whereas our adaptive ability to this coronavirus is significant, but it's not as overwhelming as one would like it to be. But in terms of the fear, one interesting thing is when people have ideas that are not really good for human beings, often they try to scare them. So if you look at, I mean, this may be a controversial example, but if you look at the COVID stuff, like there's a question of what's the standard by which we're making decisions. And early on, and even still to a significant extent today, the standard seems to be minimizing deaths of this particular virus. right? When you hear people talk about it, they just think that the purpose of government is to reduce the number of deaths from this particular virus. And if you think about that, that's like an insane standard. How could that possibly be the standard to say, okay, all we care about is as few people dying as possible from this virus. We don't care about any other aspect of life, and we don't care about people's choices. But that's really what's been happening. And a lot of people would rebel against that and say, well, this doesn't make sense and I can make my own choices. And many people would say, well, I'm not even at particularly high risk. And notice what happened was there was a huge emphasis early on trying to scare everybody into thinking that this was a death ray that would immediately kill you. And if you didn't do what the government said, then you were going to die, or at least you were going to kill hundreds of other people. So there was this catastrophism that had a kernel of truth. I mean, it's a novel, contagious virus that, at least in certain doses and for certain people, can be deadly. But it was catastrophized in that way. And the fear helped put over this idea of, the whole purpose of government should be to control our lives, to minimize deaths from this particular virus. And I think you see the same thing with the anti-fossil fuel movement, but more broadly, what I would call the anti-impact movement, where if you really tell people, hey, we should minimize our impact on the planet, that's the goal. People, if they think about that seriously, they'd rebel against it. But then you tell them, but if you don't minimize your impact, you're going to global warming hell. Like the earth is going to get so hot and the ice caps are going to melt. It's going to all overwhelm you. And there's a kernel of truth in that. I do believe that rising CO2 levels have a warming influence, but it's catastrophized out of all proportion. I mean, they don't acknowledge, for example, CO2 levels have been 15 times higher in the history of this planet than they have today. Temperatures have been 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and those were very long periods of time where life thrived. And we have no idea how to get our planet to that state, even if we wanted to. So it's in both cases, I think, people with goals that they can't really sell. This is particularly true of the leaders. The goals that people won't really adopt on their own, they put over by scaring them into saying, if you don't adopt my program, and including the massive coercion involved in achieving my goals, then you are going to die and you're going to be killing everyone else.
Yeah, one of the challenges in topics like this is when you see stuff like that pushed down from the top or just from other kind of green organizations. It's like I always wonder who is an idiot dupe here and is just going along and thinking that they know what they're doing, and who knows that there's some dishonesty that they're pushing. And of course, you can't talk about climate change and CO2 emissions without the famous 97% of all climate scientists stat. And that's thrown around all the time. If you doubt global warming or climate change, if you doubt that it's going to be a catastrophe, well, 97% of climate scientists say it is. Can you talk about that? Because that's the most obvious straw man to knock down, I think, in this debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think an analogy is helpful. So what if I said to you, 97% of doctors agree that antibiotics have side effects. Therefore, you shouldn't use antibiotics. What would you say?
Yeah, I would say that sounds crazy, Alex.
Well, but no, I mean, 97% of doctors agree that antibiotics have some side effects, but that the conclusion is
crazy.
It's
the second part, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. The conclusion is crazy. So the fact that something has side effects, even if 100% of people say it, doesn't at all mean you shouldn't use it. It just means you should consider those side effects when you're deciding whether to use it. But if it's an antibiotic that's going to add 20 years to your life, then you should use it, even if it has side effects. And if there are long-term concerns about side effects that are even greater, and I do have those with antibiotic use, you still have to keep in mind the benefits. So I think the most blatant thing about the 97% claim is how it goes from climate change is real, and notice how vague that is. So it basically just means fossil fuel use has some climate side effect. It goes from that to you shouldn't use fossil fuel. So there's just an illogic to it in terms of it's only looking at the side effects and it's not looking at the benefits. And as part of that, it's not weighing the side effects. It's not differentiating between, say, mild influence on climate and a massive and catastrophic influence on climate. So there's just, if somebody says something to you that's super vague, that's a really big red flag. And if they say something where they're only looking at the side effects of something and not the benefits, that's another red flag. So it's clearly a manipulation technique. And then the whole invocation of scientists, I think part of what that accomplishes is that makes people think, oh, well, if you're using the word scientists, this must be a logical argument. But it's not a logical argument. And then it gets even worse. I talk about this in the book, but if people look up on Prager University, I have a 5-minute video, 5 minutes or so, where I go into some of this. But if you look at even the 97%, it ends up being totally dishonest. That just the way they select the papers and whatnot. But if you can see that the argument itself is dishonest, and then also it's trying to put something over by being super vague and saying, oh, climate change is real, and getting you to think, oh, climate change is catastrophic, and oh, we shouldn't use fossil fuels, and none of that follows. But if you see that, then it shouldn't be too surprising that the rest of it is dishonest. And also even that 97% of scientists say something, is that evidence? Like, why don't you give the evidence that the 97% have? And when you ask people who invoke this, they have no idea what the evidence really is. So it's really a remarkable feat of illogic to have in one sentence so much of a distortion and a manipulation.
When you talk to people, normies, we'll call it, about this subject, this topic, what's the most common fallacy you come across from them?
Well, when I talk about it, a lot of what I try to do, and I try to do today, and whenever I talk, is I try to frame the issue in a certain way. So, for example, I'll talk from the beginning about how you need to look at both the benefits and the side effects of all the alternatives. Another way of thinking of that is you need to look at the full context. I'll talk about the goal is, we want the best, we want to improve the planet for human beings. So we want the world to be a better place. We don't want to minimize our impact. And I think it's important to, if you can get people to start from a better place, it's a lot easier for them to process the information. Because if you can get people to see, oh, we're going to look carefully at both the benefits and the side effects, then they're not as vulnerable to something like the 97%. So once it's framed properly, I think the two big, you can call them fallacies, or at least I think factual errors, are one is that rising CO2 levels will have a catastrophic warming influence. And then two is that the benefits of fossil fuels in terms of low cost, reliable energy for billions of people can be readily replaced by renewable sources. I think those are the two big falsehoods.
I kind of thought one of the red pilling moments of this book was this quote. And you say, if fossil fuels created no waste, including no CO2, if they were cheaper, if they would last practically forever, if there were no resource depletion concerns, the green movement would still oppose them. Why is that?
I had forgotten about that sentence, but I like it. It's kind of fun to listen to something I wrote a long time ago. So I think that so there's a discussion in the book about a historical example of what's called nuclear fusion, which for our purposes is just there were claims that you would have sort of an infinitely cheap, reliable, free, clean, safe source of energy, and the dominant response from what's called the environmental movement, but which I think of as the anti-impact movement, is that they said this is horrible. Like, we need to stop this. It would be a disaster. One person said it would be like giving an idiot child a machine gun. And you think, is that really possible? But then if you think of the logic of being green and minimizing our impact, well, if you really want to do that, and they don't make a distinction between impact that helps us and impact that harms us, if all impact is bad, then the worst thing that you can do is give people more energy. Because what energy does is I think of it as machine calories. The more energy we use, the more machine power we use. And machine power allows us to amplify our physical abilities far beyond their natural level. And it allows us to do things that we couldn't do without machines. But everything we do with machines in one way or another has an impact on the earth. So the cheaper energy is, the more impact we have on the earth. And so if your whole philosophy is let's minimize impact, then the last thing you want is for 8 billion people to have enough power where they can build their own big house for themselves. And they can, grow ample food, and they can all have a car. And even at some point, maybe they can all have a private jet. Like if you view impact on the earth as bad, the lower cost and the fewer downsides energy has for people, the more they'll use it and the more they'll impact the earth. And I think that's a great thing because I believe in impacting the earth. I don't think the earth starts out perfect. I think we need to perfect it. But if you view the earth as perfect and all human impact is bad, then the more energy, the worse.
Right. Would you say that's the same line of thought that I've heard a lot of people in the green movement say the earth is overpopulated? Is basically that the kind of foundation they're using?
That's a lot of it. Whenever you hear these kinds of claims, there's always a question of, are they on a human standard? So even with the overpopulation, which when people talk about overpopulation, I think you should be very skeptical.
Yes.
There's this line by P.J. O'Rourke that I read when I was 16 that I still remember. He just had a chapter title called Overpopulation, Just Enough of Me, Way Too Much of You.
Right.
As the perspective
right.
of people who, it's basically someone is very close to saying, hey, we need to get rid of a whole bunch of humans.
Yes.
And that should be a big warning sign. And usually the person is not leading by example. And even if they were, it would be really bad. But you can talk about it. Is the concern really, well, there's overpopulation, like what's this guy, Malthus, the from a couple hundred years ago. So the theorist Malthus, who's known as having this Malthusian perspective of we're going to run out of resources. But, he at least seems to be on a human standard. He's basically saying, yeah, if humans do this, then the future humans or even the near future humans, they're going to be in a lot of pain. So is that your concern? That's one thing versus if it's just, no, it's wrong for there to be so many humans. We want, because the less impact we have, the better. And that means the fewer humans we have, the better. And often they're blended together for reasons I see. I think it's because people who are really anti-human want to inspire fear in others. So they give these kinds of practical justifications. But I do think at the bottom of it, if you look at it, yeah, human beings, there are more of us than ever. We're not even multiplying at a very fast rate anymore. And yet we have a longer life expectancy and far more resources per person than ever before. So that what that shows is that human beings are resource creators. And in general, the more of us there are, the more wealthy each individual can be because we're producers who can take basically useless raw materials in nature and make them valuable by using our minds to figure out how to transform them. So if you just really think about the history of capitalism, there's no need to be worried about overpopulation from a human perspective. And so I think the people who are more knowledgeable and still advocate this view of overpopulation, it's really it's a values issue. It's just saying there are too many people. It's wrong for there to be 8 billion people on Earth. Maybe there should be 1 billion.
I want to go over some of in chapter 7, there's a few fallacies. It's really good to understand these because once you read this from your perspective, and I want the listeners to hear it from your perspective, things click like, okay, these are the things that people say when we're discussing climate change. So can you talk about the false attribution fallacy?
Yeah, definitely. So false attribution is where there's some negative phenomenon in the world. And so let's say there's a cancer cluster of people, and then you attribute it falsely to some fossil fuel-based cause. Now, there certainly can be true attribution where you're saying there's something wrong and it's not, and it was caused by fossil fuels. But this is just a very, very common fallacy that's used. And just an example that's been prominent in the last 10 or so years is with what's called fracking or hydraulic fracturing. What people would do is they would take groundwater near where fracking occurs, and they would say, oh, this groundwater has methane in it. Methane is basically natural gas. So therefore, the methane came from the fracking. Whereas in almost every case, no, the methane was naturally occurring. Methane is very commonly occurs in groundwater, which actually relates to another fallacy, which is the natural fallacy, which is the idea that everything natural is good. And so people have this idea that everything in nature is perfectly clean until human beings make it dirty. And so the view is, oh, if it's groundwater, it must be pristine. But Mother Nature, there's no Mother Nature, but the rules of nature did not decide we are going to keep all of this water pristine for humans. That's not the way it actually works. And so that's one thing that drives false attribution, is often people will attribute natural problems to human beings. And you see this with climate too. You see that there's always this tendency whenever there's really bad weather to say humans did it, and when there's good weather to say nature did it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, and you make a good distinction in the artificial fallacy section on anti-pollution and anti-development, because they're often put together. And I liked the distinction that you made there.
Yeah, so you could think of it as pollution. That's an anti-human impact, whereas development is a pro-human impact. And so when people frame themselves as, I'm for minimizing human impact, and that's really what the whole idea of green means. Notice they're packaging those together. They're packaging together the anti-human human impacts and the pro-human human impacts, and yet the impacts are overwhelmingly positive that we have on the earth. And so what they've done is they've demonized all human impact on the earth by packaging it with the negative ones. And I don't think that's an innocent mistake by the leaders. I think the leaders are just anti-human. So they think human impact is bad because they just think it's bad, and they think humans are bad, and it's unfair. There's a whole bunch of reasons behind that, including psychological ones. But it's just they're against human impact, not because it's not when it's bad for human beings, but just because they think it's wrong for us to do.
All right, I got to respect your time. Before I get you out of here, I just give your pitch to the people listening of why this book that you wrote is important, because I genuinely think it is. It turned me on to this subject matter, so there's at least that. So give your pitch for this book.
Well, I think I think the fact that you were enthusiastic about it will be a good pitch to your listeners. But I'll just go back to what I said about my own interest in it. I mean, energy is the industry that powers every other industry. Think about it. We live in an industrial civilization, and we don't live in a manual labor civilization. At least several billion of us are fortunate enough to live in an industrial machine labor civilization, which means that machines can do most of our physical work for us, which means that we can produce the nourishment we need, and we can produce the protection we need from all the different dangers of nature, including viruses. And we can do that, in very low amount of time relative to somebody who's in a manual labor world who really can't do much to overcome nature. And so it's an amazing world that we live in, and it's all made possible by energy, because when the lower cost energy is, the lower cost it is to produce everything, and the higher cost energy is, the higher cost it is to produce everything. So I'd first sell people on making the right decisions about energy matters a lot, and we can't just look at the side effects of different forms of energy. We need to look at how good are they at producing low-cost, reliable energy for billions of people. And then I think if you really value energy, and more broadly, if you value human life, you'll start to see, oh my gosh, fossil fuels, you'd put it in the category of something like antibiotics. Like, this is a crucial thing, and there's no viable, scalable alternative right now. So we really need to value it. We need to appreciate its benefits. We need to work to improve it. We can look for different alternatives. But this is an amazing positive value that's worth fighting for. And of course, you'll notice, it's people are fighting against it. So I think a lot of people who've read my book have been very motivated, like I became, to champion fossil fuels in a world that's opposing them. And everything you can do to make energy lower cost for more people, I think that's a really good thing.
Well put. Also, before you get out of here, go ahead and plug away. Anything, websites, Twitter, anything you want to plug, go ahead.
Sure. So the easiest way, if you're interested in more information about me, I have a weekly newsletter. It's not spam at all. If you just go to industrialprogress.com, you can sign up for that newsletter. And then you can find me on all the usual channels. My name's Alex Epstein, and on a lot of them, I own Alex Epstein, including Twitter. So those would be the two I'd recommend.
Excellent. And I will link to those in the show notes page for this episode. Alex Epstein, thank you so much for being here on Death to Tyrants.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Mr. Epstein. That was, I'm telling you, get this book. You won't be disappointed. It's on Audible and it's on Amazon. So either way, I highly, highly recommend it. And go check out his website. I'm going to link to that, of course, industrialprogress.com. Let's see. If you want to join the Libertarian Party and you want to do it through this show, go ahead and go to lp.org/death to tyrants. You can find us online. You already know this. Facebook.com/Death to Tyrants podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. And if you love the show, you can donate to it via Patreon. Patreon.com/Death to Tyrants. Every cent I make from that goes directly into this show because I do have the best production around. Podsworth Media. They are the best. Chris Williams is the man over there. And all right, guys, I will see y'all next week.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram wrath. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.